Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, everybody. Can you believe it? It's the finale episode. I have had such a blast navigating the topics of Season 2, challenging dogma, and asking for those of us to think critically and to embrace skepticism. And boy, have we covered a lot of topics. I'd love to hear, is there a particular episode that you really liked? What was your favorite? According to the analytics, the top episode from this season was From Doctrine to Practice, Exploring Faith, Parenting Styles, and Mental Wellness with Marissa Burt. Second up was the opener episode From Conspiracy to Cult, unveiling the interplay between radicalization, conspiracies, and religion. The top third episode was Breaking Down the Power Play, Women's Suffrage, Christian Patriarchy, and the Trad Wife Propaganda. And when it comes to geographic locations, we've grown there too, guys. It's so exciting. Of course, we're here in the US, Canada, Australia, United Kingdom, Albania, Italy, South Africa, New Zealand, Belgium, Russia, Germany, Mexico, Austria, Netherlands, India, Denmark, Dubai, Nepal, Japan, Bulgaria, Philippines, Singapore, Sweden, Portugal, and Panama. So if you're listening, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It is so freaking cool that my voice can travel across the world. And if you've yet to leave me a 5-star review, find me on Instagram, Pinterest, X. I'd love to hear from you. Like I said, what was your favorite episode? Did you learn anything? I'd really love to hear from you. I can't stress that enough. So as we're closing down Season 2 chapter, I am struck by how much this journey has really opened my eyes. From health and fitness to unraveling history's mysteries, I've learned that curiosity is the key to deeper truths. And thank you guys so much for walking this path with me. Let's keep questioning, keep growing, and never stop seeking. And without further ado, let's kick off today's episode. Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we unravel the strange, the mysterious, and today, the terrifying. Since it's almost Halloween, I wanted us to peel back the layers on one of history's darkest chapters, the witch hunts. Today we're going to be exploring how fear, superstition, and control shaped centuries of persecution, and how, if we look closely, we can see the patterns of the modern world. Witch hunts are not just a thing of the past. They've just simply evolved. Let's start in early modern Europe, and we're going to be exploring the work of Peter Maxwell Stewart. He's a scholar that illuminates the rise of demonology, where the fear of magic and the devil became a weapon of control for those who were in power. So we're starting in the very beginning of the 1500s, and we see political and religious leaders were manipulating entire populations by tapping into their deep-rooted fears of evil forces. And the church particularly was weaponizing these beliefs, and it positioned itself as the protector against the witches, which were mostly women, but about 30% were men, and they were believed to be consorting with the devil or were conjuring up dark forces. So as this idea that witches could be behind every famine, illness, and death started to take hold, this is what created a perfect storm of paranoia. So Stewart argues that demonology texts, many were sanctioned by the church, fueled mass hysteria, feeding the narrative that witches were not just local troublemakers, but cosmic agents of Satan himself and were hell-bent on destroying Christendom. Ordinary people lived in constant fear of betrayal by their neighbors, leading to accusations that could swiftly escalate into brutal trials, with the accused often being tortured into confessing their diabolical crimes. And so there are so many different layers that I wanted to go into the social and cultural context that led to the European witch trials. And I really want to take some time to understand how demonology in Europe was gaining such traction. And we've got to go back in time to St. Augustine of Hippo. And I have mentioned this guy before. His writings were very popular in the 4th and 5th centuries, and they laid the foundation for Christian perceptions of the devil and demons. St. Augustine's ideas, especially in his writing called City of God, emphasize the constant spiritual warfare between good and evil, casting demons as agents of Satan working tirelessly to undermine God's plan. He argued that humans were caught in this cosmic battle, susceptible to the devil's temptations and tricks. So let's talk more about Augustine's doctrine of demons. So according to him, demons were fallen angels, once part of the divine realm, who had rebelled and now sought to deceive and destroy humanity. Augustine didn't explicitly talk about witches, but his interpretations of demons helped fuel the beliefs that humans could be manipulated by evil spirits, whether it was through pacts, possession, or magical practices. So it was this idea that later influenced medieval and early modern European demonology. But it wasn't just that. The perfect setup for witch hunts was his views on original sin, which I've talked about in numerous episodes. Let's see, if we go back to the episode called Franciscan Wisdom, Navigating Spiritual Growth and Challenges with Carrie Moore, we specifically spun the doctrine of original sin on its head. And then also Unpacking Religious Trauma, Navigating the Dynamics of Faith Deconstruction, which was episode 4 of this season with Dr. Mark Gregory Karras. Back to what I was saying though, his views on original sin, which are basically that humanity is inherently flawed and in need of salvation, is what also intensified fears that people, especially women who were seen as spiritually weaker, were more vulnerable to the devil's influence. And in the centuries that followed, these ideas were weaponized to justify witch hunts. St. Augustine's legacy can be seen in how later theologians and demonologists, such as Heinrich Kramer, who's the author of the infamous Malleus Maleficarum. I tried my hardest to pronounce that. That means the Hammer of the Witches, and this was a notorious book on witchcraft published in 1487. This built upon St. Augustine's ideas of demonic interference to condemn witchcraft as real and a real threat to Christian society. So in his work, Maxwell Stewart reveals that the creation of demonology wasn't just religious, but also deeply political. Kings and clergy alike realized that they could consolidate power by stoking the flames of fear, casting witches and sorcerers as the common enemy. So it seems like the trials served a dual purpose. They reinforced the church's supremacy over the spiritual realm and gave the ruling elites a tool for maintaining social order. Accusing someone of witchcraft was a very effective way to silence dissent or settle personal scores. But fear wasn't just manufactured by the ruling class elite. It was deeply ingrained into society, religious, and legal systems of the time. Sophie Page, another scholar that I was studying from, reveals how beliefs in magic and the supernatural were not actually fringe ideas, but they were core components of medieval and early modern life. Magic wasn't merely a mysterious force. It was a pervasive explanation for any calamity. Failed harvest, plagues, unexplained illnesses, whether it was with people or livestock, were often attributed to witches or the devil, creating a society that was constantly on edge, where supernatural forces were believed to be lurking behind every misfortune. So really, magic was seen as a legal and religious threat. By embedding these beliefs into the legal codes, authorities could target suspected witches or sorcerers under the guise that they were protecting the community, aka what we hear today is for the greater good. So Page's work illustrates how rituals that were once seen as protective or healing gradually became demonized. For instance, harmless folk practices and herbal remedies that were used for centuries began to be recast as witchcraft, especially when things went wrong. People that were living in these rural areas were vulnerable to thinking this because religion and superstition were inseparable from daily life. So here's some things that I found interesting in my research, that partisan scholars had long debated whether Catholics or Protestants were the real witch hunters, but they've made little headway. One important change that I saw that I had to mention was the shift in Christian morality, as discussed by a researcher named John Bossie, occurred during the 14th and 16th centuries. So that's around around 1300 to 1500s, and the moral focus was shifting away from the 7 deadly sins, pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, anger, and sloth, to the 10 Commandments. So this change, very interestingly, influenced the reform movements that shaped the Protestant Reformation, prioritizing sins against God over the sins against community. So all of a sudden we saw idolatry and the worship of false gods became viewed as the gravest offenses. And this redefinition of witchcraft followed suit. Rather than being seen as harmful actions towards neighbors, witchcraft was now linked directly to devil worship and seen as a very serious heresy. We began to see a merging of various forms of folk magic and healing into this new narrative of witchcraft, suggesting that practitioners were either knowingly or unknowingly making deals with the devil. Confessions of pacts or attendance of these witch gatherings were shaped to highlight community failings like envy and resentment. And so as a result, the educated society began to see witchcraft as a real threat rather than mere superstition. While traditional beliefs about magic still existed, there was now this overshadowing fear and violent backlash from the reformers. Because of St. Augustine's teachings that were based in dualism, that the world was dominated by good versus evil, like the world is a battleground between these two forces. Orthodox Christianity once rejected this dualism because it focuses so much on the devil's role in everyday life, and it was blurring the lines for many people. So I just find this so fascinating that it was St. Augustine who gave rise to this kind of dualistic worldview. He influenced original sin, and a lot of it actually contradicted Orthodox Christianity at the time. By emphasizing the devil's pervasive influence, religious leaders like the Protestant reformers were inadvertently creating a belief system in which evil seemed as powerful as good, aka Calvinism. And see, this actually represents an ancient belief system that was deemed heresy called Manichaeism. So while this belief system isn't directly like this ancient heresy, it is very similar because they teach that the devil was not just able to tempt individuals, but was actually a corrupting force within communities and even within political and religious practices that were deemed heretical. So the fears of devil worshiping conspiracies became super intertwined with the anxieties about witchcraft and moral decay. And the reformers, especially in the Protestant movements, fueled these fears by branding idolatry, Catholic rituals, and even folk healing as dangerous openings for the devil's influence. And this perspective transformed witchcraft from a local issue into a broader threat against God and society. The result was a potent mix of this dualistic thinking and an intense focus on spiritual warfare. This not only intensified the persecution of supposed witches, but also reinforced this obsession with eliminating anything considered satanic. And this ideological shift redefined witchcraft as a common danger, turning innocent healing practices into accusations of demonic pacts. Every village had its own cunning folk, which I was reading about, and these were individuals which were skilled in healing and folk magic, and many of them were men. Yet, these people were the ones who could become easy scapegoats when something went wrong. So an example of this would be the case of Alison Device in Pendle witch trials in 1612 England. Alison was a local healer and was accused of witchcraft after a peddler, John Law, fell ill following a brief argument with her. Alison, under pressure, confessed to cursing him, and this led to a widespread witch hunt in the area. So despite being a cunning woman known for using folk remedies, Alison became an easy target during a time when communities were so fearful with these unexplained misfortunes like illness and used witchcraft accusations to explain them away. And so it wasn't just superstitions, it was the legal structures that also played a vital role in perpetuating the cycle of fear. Church courts, bolstered by theologians and demonologists, were empowered to try individuals accused of witchcraft, and then the accusations quickly spiraled into mass hysteria. Trials often relied on tortured confessions, reinforcing the belief that witches and the devil were real and tangible threats to society. The institutionalized paranoia was a perfect storm of religion, fear, and control. I am going to spare you from how dark and deranged the torture sessions were on these poor people. But if you were curious, there's a lot of really good books that I will link in the show notes if you want to read more about it. But I am absolutely not going to go there. It was hard for me to get through. So scapegoating of the witches didn't just remain a social or religious reaction to fear. It actually became systemically organized throughout the legal and institutional channels. So Sophie Page research was highlighting that the shift from isolated witchcraft accusations to more of these large-scale witch hunts was driven by a combination of a couple things: religious fervor, political instability, and the legal frameworks that reinforce this need to identify and eliminate perceived threats. So I mentioned earlier the infamous witch hunting manual that was published in 1487. It was endorsed by the Pope, and that offered the legal and theological justifications for hunting down witches. It encouraged the harsh interrogations, and it also set the guidelines for identifying witches based on superficial evidence like birthmarks, behaviors, and the confessions I mentioned earlier that were extracted under torture. So the legal system, which had already started to turn against folk healers, now had a codified method for persecuting them. So in regions like Germany, Scotland, and Switzerland, particularly Calvinist Scotland, these legal trials turned into widespread witch hunts. Hundreds, even thousands of individuals, predominantly women, were accused and executed. Now, they weren't normally burned at the stake, which is what everybody thinks. A lot of them were hanged, some of them were strangled, and then burned at the stake. So what I found particularly fascinating is that these witch hunts were often peaking during particular periods of societal and economic instability. So when fear and uncertainty were at the highest, this made people more susceptible to attributing their misfortunes to external supernatural forces. And by institutionalizing the persecution of witches, rulers and religious leaders could not only manage societal unrest, but they were also solidifying their authority. The trials often were reinforcing the power structures that were demonstrating that anyone perceived as a threat to societal order, whether through suspected witchcraft or merely social nonconformity, could be easily eradicated. Of course, we cannot touch base on witch hunts without addressing gender. So now we're diving into Owen Davies' work, and he was revealing how the demonization of witches was definitely intersecting with misogyny, turning the hunts into a gendered form of control. Midwives, healers, or outspoken women were more likely to be targeted, reinforcing that patriarchal authority. And the very skills that once had been valued, like we were saying earlier about healing, midwifery, were redefined as dangerous and were linked to dark powers. And as we saw the witch hunt spreading, the legal framework across Europe became more refined and institutionalized, creating this climate where fear of witches and demonic possession became the norm. Like I said, many of these witches were forced to confess under coercion and brutal conditions, furthering the paranoia in the public. As the more people were confessing to witchcraft, it became more of a tangible threat, leading to a self-perpetuating cycle of accusation and persecution. So Owen Davies took it a step further, explaining how the figure of the witch didn't disappear even after the height of the trials. So even when the flames of persecution started to die down, societies continued to fear and hunt modern witches, scapegoats for anything that defied the norm. Davies shows that the witch hunts had some unnerving continuality. The same fears and superstitions that fueled the 16th century executions continue to shape our present-day paranoia. I mean, I know we'd all like to think that we've evolved past such hysteria, and we're not accusing our neighbors of practicing black magic anymore. I mean, I know Tucker Carlson definitely thinks that witchcraft is real, but when we look closer, we can see that patterns of those witch hunts play out in many other forms. Whether it's through the moral satanic panics that we've talked about on past episodes, or the scapegoating of people who challenge the status quo, fear is definitely still being weaponized. Think about modern political witch hunts in the media. We see individuals and entire groups being demonized, just like the witches were in the past. Fears of outsiders, deviants, or enemies of the state. Those are just the new versions of old fears. What Owen Davies points out is that today, the targets may have changed, but the mechanics remain eerily familiar. People are still condemned without evidence, just like the accused witches of old. That brings me back to what I was saying earlier about power dynamics. We are still seeing those powers stoke fears to maintain control today. Whether it's political leaders, media outlets, or influential figures, they definitely know that fear is one of the most effective ways to control populations. And in the same way that witches became scapegoats for failed crops, plagues, modern witches are blamed for societal unrest and political instability. So while literal accusations of witchcraft may have faded, the essence of hunting, scapegoating, and moral panic is alive and well. One modern parallel that we can't ignore is the use of lawfare and political manipulation, often seen in the persecution of high-profile figures, especially in government and intelligence circles. I mean, lawfare and the use of legal systems as a weapon against political opponents has become a modern-day witch hunt. We see former presidents, world leaders, political descendants face intense legal scrutiny, not necessarily based on the severity of their crimes, but as a way to discredit and dismantle their influence. I mean, does this sound familiar? Just like in the 1600s, accusations are a way to silence opposition and maintain control. History tells us that this is a well-worn tactic. I mean, in the age of social media, legal accusations can spread like wildfire, and court of the public opinion often acts faster than the courts themselves. Political enemies are dragged through the mud with allegations that may or may not have any basis in fact. For example, the beloved Michael Jackson faced multiple allegations of child molestation, and the most notable case was in 2005, which was a highly publicized trial. Accusers claimed that Jackson had abused them, but the defense presented strong counterarguments, including questioning the credibility of the witnesses and highlighted the inconsistencies in their testimony. And after a very lengthy trial, Jackson was acquitted on all charges. And this case stirred considerable media frenzy and public debate. They called him Wacko Jacko. The media smeared him, and it was all lies. You know what was really going on? Michael Jackson was in the midst of a lawsuit against Sony Music, which he was reportedly winning at the time of these allegations. His controversial doctor, Conrad Murray, who administered the drugs to Jackson, actually faced legal consequences for his role in Jackson's death, including manslaughter charges. So the legal battles and this media frenzy contributed to a very complex narrative that destroyed his legacy, and that's what breaks my heart. By the time these individuals have had a chance to try to clear their names, their reputations, and often their careers are already in ruins. Davies' research showed us that while modern witch hunts don't involve burning at the stake, they definitely involve trial by media and mob justice. And I mean, we can't talk about modern-day witch hunts without bringing in the CIA into the conversation. Since its inception, the CIA has been at the heart of international political manipulations, using covert methods to shape political perception, interfering with foreign governments, and can even influence elections here in the United States. In the 1960s, the agency coined the term conspiracy theorist to discredit anyone who questioned the official narratives surrounding the events like the assassination of JFK. So those who didn't want to toe the line were labeled as paranoid, dangerous, and it was the modern version of labeling someone a witch that turned them into a social outcast, not to be trusted. Fast forward to today, and we are still seeing similar tactics used against whistleblowers, journalists, and activists who challenge the powerful. I mean, think Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, or even political figures targeted by intelligence communities. The second they start exposing uncomfortable truths, they are vilified. Whether through leaks, smear campaigns, or selective legal action, these modern-day witches face an onslaught of accusations designed to discredit them before they can even tell their full story. In many cases, the evidence behind these accusations are shaky at best. The CIA's involvement in manipulating public perception goes all the way back to Operation Mockingbird, which was a secret program to influence media narratives which showed that controlling information was one of the most powerful tools they had. So if you don't know about Operation Mockingbird, you should. It's a covert campaign initiated by the CIA in the late 1940s and is aimed at influencing and controlling the media narratives to align with U.S. interests during the Cold War. And it involved recruiting journalists and establishing relationships with major media outlets. Edward Bernays, often referred to the father of public relations and a significant figure in propaganda, is sometimes mentioned in these discussions about media manipulation. And Edward Bernays worked in several major companies, including Procter & Gamble, General Electric, and American Tobacco Company. He was very influential in promoting the cigarette brand Lucky Strike and helped link them with the women's liberation movement. Other notable figures that he's connected to is Sigmund Freud, which was his uncle, whose psychoanalysis theories also shaped Bernays' PR strategies and various political leaders and organizations to seek leverage with media and how it can influence the public. If that's not a rabbit hole to go down, I suggest you do. So accusations, whether it's a conspiracy, treason, or subversion, become tools to silence anyone questioning the status quo. Just as witches in the past were seen as different and therefore dangerous, today's targets are often people who challenge the system. And while the 1600s there was no due process for the accused witches, today we see something similar in the digital realm. There's no real accountability or fairness in the court of public opinion. All it takes is a viral accusation, a tweet, a blog post, or a video with that person's career, family, and mental health can be obliterated overnight. No evidence required, no trial, no defense. That's cancel culture for you. So, what can we learn from this history? From the witch hunts of early modern Europe to today's viral accusations and political fear-mongering, there's one key lesson. Fear remains one of the most dangerous tools of control. When we allow fear to dictate our actions, whether it's fear of witches, outsiders, or anyone who doesn't fit the mold, we lose sight of reason and humanity. In closing down, I'd like to look at this through the lens of amygdala hijacking, which was a topic we covered on a previous episode. The term refers to the brain's immediate response to perceived threats, where the amygdala, the emotional center of your brain, takes over, often leading to irrational and impulsive actions. So during the witch hunts, communities were gripped by fear of the unknown, and this fear often led to that mob mentality we saw. When someone fell ill or misfortune struck, the amygdala would trigger a fight or flight response, compelling people to find a scapegoat. Cunning folk and those who strayed from societal norms became the prime targets. The hysteria would spiral as accusations flew, and instead of rational thought, fear dominated decision-making. And today, as I've said, we can see similar patterns in how social media can incite panic, leading to modern witch hunts. When fear takes over, often reason will fade, and individuals can be unjustly vilified, echoing the dark lessons of history. This is a potent reminder of the need to maintain critical thinking, especially when emotions are high. The witch hunts of the past may seem far away, but as we've seen today, the patterns remain. And that's all I have for you today, folks. Thanks again for tuning in to Taste the Truth Tuesdays, and this concludes our Season 2. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and we will be back for Season 3 come January 2025. Confirmed guests for Season 3 are Yasmin Mohammed, who's a Canadian university instructor and human rights activist and author. We have Connie A. Baker, who's a religious and spiritual abuse expert. And we have an interview with the well-being doctors who work in evidence-based mental health research, and they're going to be talking about how fitspiration images, like looking at fit babes on Instagram, can really negatively impact our body image, and more about body appreciation and body image dissatisfaction. So I'm really excited about what Season 3 has in store. I cannot wait. Looking forward to it. And until then, maintain your curiosity, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in. See you next year.